At 57, the tragedy of Owen Wilson is not loud, not chaotic, not splashed daily across headlines. It is quieter than that, more subtle, more haunting precisely because it hides behind one of the most recognizable smiles in modern Hollywood. For more than 2 decades, audiences have associated him with a certain easygoing charm. The soft Texas drawl, the crooked grin, the effortless comedic timing that made him feel less like a movie star and more like someone you already knew. He wasn't the loudest presence on screen. He was the calm in the chaos, the ironic observer drifting through absurd situations with a shrug and a half-smile. But behind that persona was a man carrying pressures that few people truly understood. Wilson's story began long before global fame. In the 1990s, he emerged not just as an actor, but as a creative collaborator, co-writing Bottle Rocket with Wes Anderson. That partnership wasn't just professional, it was foundational. It positioned Wilson as a thoughtful storyteller, someone who understood tone, rhythm, and emotional nuance. Yet as Hollywood embraced him, it simplified him. The industry discovered that audiences adored his laid-back, slightly detached comedic presence, and soon that became the brand. Film after film reinforced the same archetype: the charming slacker, the lovable rogue, the man who never seems fully rattled by life. But life does rattle people, even those who appear immune. By the mid-2000s, Wilson was everywhere. Major comedies, box office hits, high-profile relationships. Public fascination with his personal life intensified, particularly as paparazzi culture reached its most aggressive era. Breakups became tabloid fuel. Rumors became headlines. The distance between private struggle and public image began to collapse. And then, in 2007, everything shifted. News broke that Wilson had been hospitalized following what was widely reported as a suicide attempt. The revelation stunned fans. The man who seemed permanently relaxed, permanently amused, had privately reached a point of such overwhelming despair that he nearly ended his life. It was a rupture in the illusion. The smile suddenly looked different. The laugh sounded fragile in hindsight. Hollywood paused, briefly. Colleagues offered support. Projects were delayed. And then, as the industry tends to do, it moved on. But Wilson did not simply move on. He withdrew. Interviews became scarce. Public vulnerability was replaced with careful silence. He returned to work? Yes, but something in his presence felt altered, more guarded, more inward. The deeper tragedy is not that he struggled. Many do. It is that his public identity was built almost entirely on lightness, on ease, on the idea that nothing could truly wound him. That contrast between the carefree image and the internal darkness makes his story so profoundly human. Mental health does not discriminate based on success. Fame does not insulate against despair. If anything, the constant performance of happiness can intensify isolation. At 57, Owen Wilson stands as a survivor of a battle that nearly consumed him. His career endured. His talent remained undeniable. But survival carries weight. It leaves marks. In recent performances, particularly in more reflective roles, there's a subtle gravity behind his humor, a softness that feels less like acting and more like lived experience. It is the look of someone who has known how close the edge can be. The tragedy of Owen Wilson is not defined by scandal or career collapse. It is defined by the invisible war he fought while the world laughed. And perhaps that is the most heartbreaking truth of all. Sometimes the people who make us feel the safest, the happiest, the most entertained are quietly fighting battles we never see. What made the years after 2007 even more complex for Owen Wilson was not simply recovery. It was reintegration. Hollywood is not designed for stillness. It does not reward retreat. When a public figure disappears, even for deeply human reasons, the industry keeps moving, the audience shifts, and narratives form in the absence of facts. Wilson returned to work, but the terms of his existence had subtly changed. Every red carpet appearance carried an unspoken question. Every smile was analyzed. Every laugh was measured against that dark chapter. In the years following his hospitalization, he avoided turning his pain into spectacle. There was no confessional media tour, no public unraveling, no dramatic reframing of himself as a tragic figure. Instead, he chose something far more difficult: discretion. He let the work speak again. Films like Marley and Me and Midnight in Paris re-established his box office presence. But attentive viewers noticed something new in his performances. There was fragility beneath the charm, a hesitation, a weight behind the eyes that had not been there in earlier comedies. It was subtle, but it was real. The tragedy deepens when you examine the paradox of his public identity. Wilson's entire career had been built on a kind of emotional lightness. He was a guy who never took things too seriously, the man who navigated chaos with bemused detachment. But depression does not align neatly with that archetype. To suffer privately while portraying effortlessness publicly creates a dissonance that can be psychologically exhausting. You're not only battling your own mind, you're protecting an image that the world expects you to maintain. At the same time, his personal life became increasingly complex. Fatherhood entered the picture. Relationships evolved and dissolved under the relentless gaze of media culture. There were reports about strained dynamics, especially regarding one of his children, details that were discussed publicly but never fully contextualized. The public rarely understands the intricacies of private decisions, yet judgment is swift and permanent. For someone already navigating mental health vulnerability, that pressure compounds quietly. Another dimension of Wilson's story is the broader cultural environment of the 2000s. This was an era before open conversations about mental health became normalized. Male vulnerability, particularly in Hollywood, was still stigmatized. Strength meant silence. Recovery meant privacy. There were few public frameworks for discussing anxiety, depression, or suicidal ideation without career consequences. In that climate, Wilson's choice to survive and continue working without exploiting his pain was both protective and isolating. By his 50s, something else became clear. Endurance does not erase trauma. It reshapes it. In later roles, particularly in more reflective characters, there's a noticeable gentleness in his demeanor. His performance in Loki, for example, introduced audiences to a quieter, more introspective version of Wilson. The humor was still there, but it was layered with patience and contemplation. It felt less like performance and more like perspective, as if life had stripped away some of the irony and replaced it with lived understanding. At 57, the tragedy of Owen Wilson is not a single event frozen in 2007. It is the long shadow that event cast over everything that followed. It is the invisible recalibration of identity, the quiet recalculation of purpose, the daily choice to stay present in a world that once felt unbearable. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is this: the public will likely never know the full cost of that survival. The therapy sessions, the internal negotiations, the moments of doubt that never made headlines. Yet there is something quietly powerful in his continued presence. He did not reinvent himself through reinvention theatrics. He did not rebrand as a motivational figure. He simply kept working, kept showing up, kept participating in life. In an industry obsessed with dramatic comebacks and redemption arcs, his path was understated. And that understatement may be the clearest indicator of genuine resilience. When people think of Owen Wilson, they still think of laughter, of quotable lines, of that familiar voice. What they rarely think about is the man who once stood at the edge of his own existence and chose not to fall. At 57, his life is not defined by a headline or a rumor. It is defined by survival. Complicated, imperfect, ongoing survival. And that is what makes his story beyond heartbreaking. Not because it ended in tragedy, but because it almost did, and because the world only saw the smile while the storm was raging behind it. There is another layer to the story of Owen Wilson that rarely gets discussed, and it has less to do with the crisis itself and more to do with what happens after survival. Because surviving a public collapse is not the same as healing from it. Survival is immediate. Healing is prolonged. And in Wilson's case, healing unfolded under the quiet but constant gaze of an industry that never fully forgets. In Hollywood, identity is currency. For years, Wilson's identity was built on spontaneity. The improvised line, the shrug, the offbeat timing that made him seem naturally untouchable. But after 2007, something in that spontaneity felt recalibrated. It wasn't gone. It was refined, as if he had learned the cost of emotional exposure and adjusted accordingly. His humor became more controlled, his interviews more measured. Even his body language suggested a man who understood how fragile equilibrium can be. The heartbreaking truth is that when someone publicly battles depression, they often become defined by that chapter, no matter how much time passes. The narrative sticks. For some, it overshadows achievement. Wilson avoided that fate not by denying what happened, but by refusing to let it become his sole storyline. He didn't write a memoir dissecting his pain. He didn't frame himself as a cautionary tale. He simply continued, a choice that sounds simple but is psychologically complex. There's also the question of aging in Hollywood. At 57, Wilson exists in a space that is neither young leading man nor elder statesman. The industry shifts roles for men in their 50s, less romantic chaos, more paternal nuance, more reflective characters. And perhaps that evolution has suited him. In projects like Loki, audiences saw him embody a character defined by curiosity, empathy, and quiet steadiness. It felt aligned with where he is now, less frantic energy, more interior depth. But the tragedy lingers in subtler ways. Fame can amplify loneliness. When millions feel they know you, genuine connection becomes complicated. Trust narrows. Vulnerability feels risky. For someone who has already experienced a breaking point, that emotional calculus becomes even more delicate. How much do you reveal? How much do you protect? How do you maintain authenticity while safeguarding stability? Wilson has largely chosen privacy. And privacy, in the era of relentless digital commentary, is an act of resistance. It is also a form of self-preservation. By stepping back from excessive exposure, he created boundaries that may have been absent earlier in his career. That boundary building is rarely celebrated publicly, yet it may be one of the most significant indicators of growth. Another painful dimension of his narrative is fatherhood. Becoming a parent changes the architecture of one's internal world. For someone who once nearly succumbed to despair, fatherhood introduces both grounding responsibility and intensified fear. The weight of staying alive expands beyond oneself. Public discussions about his family life have at times been incomplete or speculative, and the complexity of those relationships cannot be reduced to headlines. But what remains clear is that parenthood adds stakes to survival. When examining Wilson's trajectory at 57, it becomes evident that the tragedy is not about decline. His career remains stable, his reputation intact. The tragedy lies in how invisible mental health battles can coexist with visible success. Society often measures wellness by external markers, box office numbers, awards, wealth, longevity. Yet none of those metrics capture the interior experience of despair or the courage required to endure it. In recent years, conversations around depression and suicidal ideation have become more open, more compassionate. Wilson's crisis occurred at a time when such openness was rare. Had it happened today, the cultural response might have been different, perhaps more supportive, perhaps less sensational. That context matters. It underscores how isolated someone in his position may have felt. And yet, there is something profoundly instructive in his continued presence. He did not allow a single catastrophic moment to define the totality of his existence. He returned to set. He collaborated. He built new creative partnerships. He stepped into roles that reflected growth rather than denial. There is quiet bravery in that continuity. At 57, Owen Wilson represents a version of resilience that is understated but real. Not triumphant, not loudly redemptive, simply steady. The heartbreak is in knowing how close he came to absence, how easily the story could have ended differently. The inspiration is in recognizing that it did not. Behind the familiar voice and relaxed cadence stands a man who understands fragility. A man who has confronted the edge and chosen, repeatedly, to step back. The public may still see the charm first, the humor, the quotable lines. But beneath that surface is a history of struggle that deepens every performance, every appearance, every quiet moment he remains here. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all is this: sometimes survival itself is the greatest act of strength. As the years move forward for Owen Wilson, what becomes increasingly evident is that his story is not structured like a traditional Hollywood arc. There was no dramatic public reinvention, no award season redemption speech framed around personal resurrection. Instead, there has been something far more human and far less cinematic: gradual stabilization. And stabilization, especially after a mental health collapse, is rarely dramatic. It is routine. It is therapy appointments that no one sees. It is choosing healthier rhythms. It is learning which environments nourish and which deplete. One of the most quietly painful elements of Wilson's narrative is how humor can become both refuge and mask. Comedians and comedic actors often live in that duality. Laughter is medicine, but can also be armor. When your professional identity is tied to being the source of lightness in other people's lives, admitting to personal darkness feels like betrayal of that role. For Wilson, whose on-screen presence has always radiated casual ease, the internal contrast may have been especially stark. The world expected him to remain unbothered. Depression does not negotiate with expectation. There's also the psychological aftershock that follows a public crisis. Once the world knows you reached a breaking point, you may feel pressure never to show weakness again. You become hyper-aware of perception. Every low mood feels dangerous. Every retreat feels suspect. That vigilance can be exhausting. The tragedy, then, is not only the initial collapse, but the prolonged awareness that millions witnessed your vulnerability. Yet over time, something else emerges: perspective. Aging brings a different lens. At 57, Wilson is no longer navigating early career volatility. He is not fighting for recognition. He is not scrambling for validation. The industry has already validated him. The audience has already embraced him. That shift allows space for intentionality. Roles can be chosen more carefully. Schedules can be shaped around personal balance rather than relentless ambition. His recent performances suggest an actor who understands restraint. There is a softness in his delivery now that feels deliberate rather than accidental. His characters often carry a quiet wisdom, a steadiness that contrasts sharply with the frantic comedic energy of his early 2000s peak. It feels less like evolution imposed by age and more like experience absorbed in a craft. The heartbreak, however, remains tethered to how easily his life could have ended in 2007. It is impossible to examine his story without acknowledging the thin line between continuation and absence. So many public figures have crossed that line. Wilson did not. And that survival subtly reframes everything that followed. Every film credit after that year carries a quiet asterisk, not of scandal, but of endurance. There is also the question of legacy. When audiences look back decades from now, they may focus on the comedies, the collaborations, the iconic lines. But embedded within that filmography is a deeper narrative about resilience in an era that did not yet fully understand mental health advocacy. Wilson's silence about the specifics of his struggle was not necessarily avoidance. It may have been self-protection in a cultural moment that offered limited compassion for male vulnerability. Fatherhood, too, likely altered his internal calculus. The responsibility of raising children introduces a new anchor. It reframes risk. It transforms personal despair into something that reverberates beyond oneself. That shift does not eliminate mental health challenges, but it changes their context. Survival becomes intertwined with responsibility. The decision to keep going carries generational impact. Another subtle layer to his tragedy is how public memory freezes people in time. Many still see Wilson as the carefree bachelor archetype of early 2000s Hollywood. But he is decades removed from that image. People evolve. Pain evolves them further. The difficulty lies in allowing the public persona to evolve alongside the private self. Wilson has managed that transition without spectacle. He did not demand reinvention. He simply aged into a different phase. And perhaps that is the quiet triumph hidden within the heartbreak. Not that he overcame adversity in a dramatic flourish, but that he integrated it. Integration is complex. It means the past does not disappear. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are. The fragility informs the strength. The near collapse informs the steadiness. At 57, Owen Wilson embodies a version of resilience that does not shout. It does not declare victory. It persists. He continues to work, continues to collaborate, continues to appear on screen with that familiar cadence, but now layered with something deeper. A gravity that suggests awareness of how fragile life can be. The tragedy of Owen Wilson is not that his story ended in heartbreak. It is that it almost did, and that the world only glimpsed the surface of that battle. Beneath the smile that made millions laugh was a man navigating despair in silence. Beneath the casual charm was a human being confronting his own limits. And maybe the most profound truth is this: survival, especially quiet survival, rarely receives standing ovations. It unfolds in ordinary days, in steady work, in the simple act of remaining. At 57, Owen Wilson's greatest achievement may not be a film role at all. It may be the decision, made repeatedly, to stay. What makes the story of Owen Wilson even more layered at this stage of his life is the quiet recalibration of identity that happens when a person survives something that was never meant to be survived. There is a before and an after in any life-altering crisis. The public often remembers the headline. The individual lives with the internal shift. For Wilson, the after did not announce itself with dramatic confession or visible transformation. It unfolded invisibly, in habits, in boundaries, in perspective. One of the hardest realities about depression, especially for high-functioning individuals, is that it can coexist with productivity. Wilson continued to act, continued to deliver box office hits, continued to collaborate with major studios. To the outside world, functionality suggested stability. But functionality is not the same as inner peace. Many who battle depressive episodes become skilled at compartmentalization. They learn how to perform wellness while privately negotiating despair. The tragedy in Wilson's narrative lies in that invisible labor, the emotional effort required simply to appear normal. Over time, however, something shifts in those who endure and remain. The need to impress fades. The urgency to prove oneself diminishes. At 57, Wilson no longer carries the pressure of emerging stardom. He exists in a space of established credibility. That freedom allows for something rare in Hollywood: selectivity without desperation. It allows a man to prioritize equilibrium over exposure. There is also the subtle maturity in how he now occupies the screen. Early in his career, his characters often leaned into irony, detached observers navigating absurdity. In more recent roles, there is less detachment and more presence. The humor is gentler, the energy steadier. It feels as though the lived experience of fragility has softened the edges of performance. Audiences may not consciously register it, but they feel it. Another often overlooked element is the cultural evolution around mental health. When Wilson's crisis occurred in 2007, celebrity vulnerability was still filtered through tabloid sensationalism. Today, public conversations about therapy, anxiety, and suicidal ideation are far more common. Younger actors speak openly about burnout. Athletes step away for psychological well-being. In many ways, Wilson existed at the edge of that transition, a high-profile example of struggle before the language around struggle became normalized. That timing matters, because navigating despair in a culture that lacks vocabulary for it intensifies isolation. There were fewer public models of recovery, fewer communal narratives about healing. His path had to be carved quietly, privately, without the framework of a broader mental health movement to contextualize it. As he moves through his late 50s, another dimension emerges: legacy awareness. Aging in Hollywood often brings existential reflection. What will endure? What truly matters? For someone who once nearly vanished from the story entirely, legacy becomes more than professional. It becomes personal. It becomes relational. The relationships with his children, with collaborators, with longtime friends, these likely carry a different weight now. The heartbreaking aspect of Wilson's life is not ongoing scandal or decline. It is the knowledge that behind one of cinema's most relaxed personas exists a man intimately familiar with psychological darkness. A man who understands how swiftly internal narratives can turn against you. That awareness does not disappear. It integrates. It humbles. There is also quiet courage in not allowing a moment of collapse to define the entirety of one's narrative. Many public figures become permanently associated with their lowest point. Wilson resisted that gravitational pull not by erasing the event, but by outliving it. He continued to accumulate credits, continued to expand his range, continued to show up. Over time, the body of work grew larger than the crisis. And perhaps that is the most powerful element of his story: scale. The crisis was catastrophic, yes, but it was not the final chapter. The chapters that followed, steady, unremarkable in a tabloid sense, are the true testament to resilience. There's something profoundly human in that ordinariness. Healing rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. It looks like sustained effort. At 57, Owen Wilson represents a form of strength that does not fit the traditional Hollywood mold. It is not loud. It is not defiant. It is not wrapped in redemption speeches. It is patient. It is consistent. It is the decision to remain engaged with life even after glimpsing the abyss. The tragedy of Owen Wilson will always be tethered to how close he came to absence. But the deeper story, the one that unfolds quietly, is about continuation, about learning to coexist with one's own mind, about aging with scars that are not visible on the surface. And in that continuation lies something quietly extraordinary: the proof that survival is not a single act, but an ongoing choice. There's a particular kind of loneliness that attaches itself to people who are known everywhere but understood nowhere. And at 57, Owen Wilson exists squarely inside that paradox. Recognition is constant. Understanding is rare. The world feels entitled to the image, the voice, the cadence, the familiar comedic rhythm, but it has never truly demanded to know the internal architecture of the man behind it. And perhaps that has been both his protection and his burden. What becomes clearer over time is that Wilson's tragedy is not rooted in chaos, but in contrast. The contrast between public levity and private weight, between the character who never seems shaken and the human being who once reached a breaking point. That dissonance does not disappear with years. It reshapes how a person moves through life. It teaches caution. It teaches selectivity. It teaches the value of stillness. There's also something deeply human about how he never weaponized his pain. In an industry that often rewards confession and spectacle, Wilson chose restraint. He did not construct a narrative of heroic suffering. He did not anchor his identity to victimhood. Instead, he quietly reclaimed authorship over his life by continuing to work without turning trauma into branding. That choice reflects a particular kind of strength, one rooted in dignity rather than performance. As time passes, survival transforms into perspective. People who have confronted despair often develop heightened awareness of fragility, not just their own, but others. That awareness softens interactions. It deepens empathy. It shifts ambition from conquest to balance. Wilson's later career suggests a man less interested in dominating headlines and more interested in sustaining equilibrium. He appears comfortable in ensemble spaces, content to contribute rather than command. The cultural lens has also evolved around him. Today, mental health is discussed with far more nuance than it was in the mid-2000s. Younger audiences consume stories of vulnerability differently. There is less mockery, more compassion. In many ways, Wilson's earlier crisis helped expand that conversation, even if unintentionally. High-profile moments of collapse forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about pressure, isolation, and the myth of celebrity invulnerability. But what often goes unexamined is the aftermath, the years after the headlines fade, the slow rebuilding of trust in oneself, the recalibration of daily habits, the discipline required to monitor one's internal state without succumbing to fear. Recovery is not linear. There are plateaus. There are setbacks. There are quiet victories that no one applauds. That long arc of stabilization may be the most profound chapter of Wilson's life. Another dimension of his story lies in identity beyond performance. For decades, he was defined primarily by how he made audiences feel. Laughter became currency. Charm became expectation. But at some point, a person must negotiate who they are when they are not performing. That negotiation can be destabilizing, especially if the performance has been consistent and rewarded. Wilson's shift toward more reflective roles suggests an integration of self rather than separation from it. Fatherhood likely reinforced that integration. The presence of children alters one's psychological landscape in ways that are difficult to articulate publicly. It adds stakes. It adds urgency to wellness. It also demands emotional availability. For someone who has experienced internal darkness, maintaining that availability requires deliberate effort. It requires commitment to self-regulation and growth. The tragedy often associated with Owen Wilson centers on a singular moment. But the deeper tragedy is how invisible his continued effort has been. Society tends to romanticize dramatic redemption arcs while overlooking sustained resilience. Wilson's path has not been dramatic. It has been steady. And steady resilience rarely becomes headline material. At 57, he stands not as a cautionary tale, but as evidence that collapse does not have to define destiny. His life underscores a quieter truth. Healing can coexist with humor. Depth can coexist with charm. Pain can coexist with productivity. The complexity of that coexistence is what makes his story compelling beyond mere heartbreak. There's also something instructive about how he navigates aging within the industry. Many actors cling to former identities. Wilson appears to have allowed his to evolve organically. There is less frenetic energy, more grounded presence. That evolution suggests acceptance, not resignation, but maturity. Acceptance that life includes rupture. Acceptance that stability must be cultivated. Ultimately, the enduring image of Owen Wilson may still be the half-smile and easy tone that defined an era of comedy. But layered beneath that image is a man who has lived through a silent storm and emerged not transformed into someone unrecognizable, but clarified. Clarified about priorities. Clarified about boundaries. Clarified about the value of remaining. And that may be the most profound aspect of his story. Not that he overcame tragedy in spectacular fashion, but that he continues, thoughtfully, deliberately, imperfectly, to exist within it and beyond it at the same time. There's a moment in every long life when the noise begins to thin out, when the urgency of youth gives way to something quieter, more reflective. At 57, Owen Wilson seems to be standing in that space, not retreating from the world, but no longer chasing it either. And when you look at his story in its entirety, the heartbreak becomes less about one catastrophic year and more about the invisible cost of living under a constant expectation to be liked. The early 2000s version of Wilson felt almost mythic in its ease. He was in hit after hit, working alongside major stars, building a filmography that defined a generation of studio comedies. The rhythm of that era was relentless. Promotion cycles, premieres, global press tours, and the perpetual presence of paparazzi culture at its peak. Fame at that level compresses time. Years blur together. Identity gets intertwined with output. And when that machinery slows, whether by choice or crisis, the silence can feel disorienting. What many people underestimate is how destabilizing sudden stillness can be. When your life has been defined by momentum, stopping forces confrontation. Confrontation with self, with unresolved pain, with questions about purpose beyond applause. Wilson's 2007 crisis may have been the breaking point, but it was likely preceded by years of accumulated pressure, professional, relational, internal. And yet, in the years since, there's been no public spiral, no repeated collapse. That absence is significant. It suggests work done quietly, systems built, support structures strengthened. Mental health management is rarely glamorous, but it is disciplined. It involves recognizing triggers, maintaining routines, accepting help. The steadiness of Wilson's subsequent decades implies deliberate recalibration rather than mere luck. Another dimension of his journey is how he has subtly redefined masculinity through restraint. In a culture that often frames male strength as dominance or invulnerability, Wilson embodies something different: continuity. He did not frame his survival as conquest. He did not perform toughness. He continued working, continued showing up, without dramatizing resilience. There is understated power in that. As he ages, the roles available to him shift, but so does the audience's perception. Younger viewers may discover him through contemporary projects, unaware of the near tragedy in his past. Older audiences carry that memory. This duality creates an unusual legacy, a man known for laughter whose life once hovered on the edge of silence. The coexistence of those truths deepens his screen presence in ways that are difficult to quantify. There is also a philosophical layer to his story. People who survive their own breaking point often describe a shift in how they perceive time. The future feels less abstract. Moments feel more fragile. Gratitude becomes more specific. It is plausible that Wilson's quieter demeanor in recent years reflects that recalibrated relationship with time, a man less concerned with acceleration and more invested in sustainability. His collaborations, too, suggest intentionality. Returning to work with long-time creative partners signals stability. Choosing projects that do not demand constant exposure signals boundaries. There is a noticeable absence of overexposure in his public life now. He appears selectively visible rather than omnipresent. That moderation is itself a learned skill. The tragedy surrounding Owen Wilson is therefore layered. It is the tragedy of proximity to absence, the tragedy of misalignment between persona and pain, the tragedy of carrying despair while embodying levity. But it is also the story of adaptation, of learning to live with awareness rather than denial, of accepting that vulnerability does not invalidate talent. At 57, he stands as an example of something rarely dramatized: sustained recovery without spectacle. The cultural appetite often favors extremes: meteoric rise, catastrophic fall, dramatic redemption. Wilson's life disrupts that template. His arc is quieter, steadier, more human. It resists simplification. And perhaps that is why it resonates so deeply, because it reflects a truth many people understand privately: that survival is not a single triumphant moment. It is a series of small, uncelebrated decisions. To get up, to go to work, to call a friend, to remain. When audiences watch him now, hear that familiar cadence, see that half smile, they're witnessing more than comedic timing. They are witnessing continuity, the continuation of a life that once came dangerously close to ending, the continuation of creativity despite internal storms, the continuation of fatherhood, collaboration, aging. The heartbreak remains embedded in the knowledge of how fragile the continuation once was. But alongside heartbreak sits something quieter and more enduring: evidence that even those who seem effortlessly light can learn to carry their own weight without collapsing beneath it.